One of the most repeated stories about the Bermuda Triangle is the disappearance of Flight 19 on December 5, 1945. Flight 19 was composed of 5 Avenger torpedo bombers doing a training exercise under the command of Lieutenant Charles Taylor, an experienced pilot. The flight plan called for the planes to fly east to make practice bombing runs near Chicken and Hen Shoals. The plan then had them continue east to a point just south of Grand Bahama Island. There the flight would turn north. Then they would make a final turn to take them on a southwesterly course back to their base at the Naval Air Station at Fort Lauderdale. At 3 p.m., a controller at Fort Lauderdale heard one of the planes ask for permission to drop a bomb, indicating the Avengers are still at the bombing range. 40 minutes later, however, Taylor was heard to say that both his compasses were out, and he was unsure of his location, but he was over broken land.
Both of my compasses are out. I am trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I am over land, but it's broken. I am sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down I am, and I don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale. This was the third-to-last voice transmission received from Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, U.S. Naval Reserve, instructor and flight leader of a group of 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers manned by a total of 14 Navy and Marine Corps officers that departed from NAS Fort Lauderdale at 14:10 hours Eastern Time on the afternoon of Wednesday, December 5th, 1945, 80 years ago today, on what was supposed to be a routine 3-hour bombing and navigation exercise. They were never seen again, and despite extensive searching, no wreckage or remains have ever been discovered. But the mystery of Flight 19 remains firmly embedded in the public consciousness, and is there any good reason for that? Without meaning to minimize the tragic loss of 14 fine young officers, no, there really isn't any good reason for that. In the waters off the Atlantic Ocean off the east coast of Florida, 92 other naval aviators were lost during similar training flights just in the final 3 years of the Second World War between the start of 1942 and the summer of 1945, but we don't know their names, we don't know their flight numbers by heart, and we haven't spent decade upon decade obsessing over where and why and how their planes went down. We remember Flight 19 because it became the final ingredient in the stew of supposition and half-truths and intellectual dishonesty that we now know as the legend of the Bermuda Triangle. It's Friday the 5th of December. This is Curmudgeon's Corner. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where, if you will permit me one fleeting cricket reference today, we remain obstinate in our belief that Travis Head can go eat a big bag of dicks. Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to Curmudgeon's Corner. Let's talk about Flight 19. The training mission was about as routine and straightforward as a routine, straightforward training mission can be. This was a training mission they flew 3 or 4 times in a typical day out of NAS Fort Lauderdale, weather permitting. It was so routine, in fact, that they called it Navigation Exercise Number 1. Lieutenant Charles Carroll, who is the flight instructor, he's a combat veteran of the Pacific Theater. He's got around 2,500 hours of stick time on this aircraft type. He is exactly the kind of guy you want for a flight instructor. The pilots in the other 4 planes, they're about as green can be. Edward Joseph Powers, Captain, U.S. Marines. George William Stivers, Captain, U.S. Marines. Forrest James Gerber, Second Lieutenant, U.S. Marines. And Joseph Tipton Bossy, Ensign, U.S. Navy. They've each got around 60 hours of stick time on the Avenger, which, as you might expect, makes them rather highly disinclined to question the judgment of their flight instructor, which is going to come rather tragically into play as our story goes on. Navigation exercise number 1 goes like this. First, you depart NAS Fort Lauderdale. You fly on a heading of 091 degrees due east, basically, for 56 nautical miles. Then you conduct a practice bombing run on Hens and Chicken Shoals, which are some outlying rocks or some islets, choose whichever term you prefer, that lay to the southwest of Grand Bahama Island. Next, you continue on your same heading of 091 degrees for a further 57 nautical miles. Then you make a left turn on a heading of 346 degrees and fly north by northwest for 73 nautical miles, during which time you overfly the mainland of Grand Bahama. After that, there is nothing left to do but make another left-hand turn to a heading of 241 degrees and fly a southwesterly course for 120 miles back home to NAS Fort Lauderdale. The purpose of the exercise, aside from the practice bombing run, is to teach the principles of dead reckoning navigation over open ocean. In other words, using your compass and your airspeed indicator and your clock to determine when you are supposed to make your turns when you are over open water and you don't have any external visual reference points. And you couldn't have had a better teacher for this type of flying than you had in Lieutenant Charles Carroll. He spent the whole second half of 1944 flying torpedo missions against Japanese Navy ships, and finding a ship in the open ocean is way the hell harder than finding an island. So he had to be really skilled and really well practiced at this type of navigation. But somewhere, somehow, someway, on this day he gets confused, and he manages to convince himself that he is in a completely different location than the one he's actually in, which was pretty much exactly where he was supposed to be. And he winds up making the classic aviation mistake of trusting his eyes and his gut rather than believing what his instruments are telling him. Lieutenant Robert Cox was back on the ground in Fort Lauderdale. He was the instructor of the next flight that was getting ready to take off and do the exact same navigation exercise number 1 that Flight 19 was in the middle of doing. And he was the one who received the transmission from Lieutenant Carroll that said, "I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale. I am over land. I'm sure it must be the Keys," and so on. But the crucial part of that transmission is when he opens it by saying, "Both of my compasses are out." In other words, he is over land, but he's not supposed to be over land, and he thinks the islands he sees look like the Florida Keys, and this leads him down a whole daisy chain of false assumptions that wound up being fatal. He rejects out of hand the simplest explanation, which is that he made his left hand turn northward to 346 degrees later than he was supposed to have done, and the islands he sees below him are in fact the eastern Bahamas, which from altitude can bear a strong resemblance to the Florida Keys. But somehow his eyes convince him that he really is over the Keys, which means he must have accidentally turned to the southwest instead of to north by northwest as he had intended, which means both of his compasses must be broken and giving him bad information. So he has formed one false assumption, and now he has reverse engineered a theory that makes the false assumption correct, and all of his subsequent decision-making proceeds from that false assumption. And he rejects all sources of information that would suggest the false assumption isn't false. Therefore, since I am over the Florida Keys and my compasses aren't working, I just have to orient myself toward the setting sun and fly northeast, and I am guaranteed to hit the Florida mainland and find my way back home. The reality, of course, is that by flying northeast, he is just heading farther out into the open ocean, away from the land that he's trying to get to. Meanwhile, back on the ground in Fort Lauderdale, with an increasing sense of foreboding, Lieutenant Cox starts flipping around listening to different frequencies, and he hears the other pilots in Flight 19 talking amongst themselves, saying, "Why the hell are we flying northeast right now? Shouldn't we be flying west? Where is this guy taking us? What are we actually doing right now? Do you want me to tell him we're going the wrong way, or do you want to tell him?" "No, I don't want to tell him. You tell him." "Hell no, I don't want to tell him." Which is to say, they were all so afraid of getting in trouble for questioning the judgment of their flight instructor, they opted instead to just keep following him straight to their collective doom. There never should have been any mystery about what happened to Flight 19, and the Navy sure didn't think there was any mystery. They conducted their investigation, and they were all set to issue a report saying the flight constructor got confused about his actual position, he made a series of errors that arose from his initial false presumption, and the planes proceeded to fly farther and farther out to sea until they exhausted their fuel and crashed into the drink. But Lieutenant Carroll's widow got wind of this somehow, and she was having none of it. "My husband was a decorated war hero," she exclaimed, "and I shall be damned if you bastards are going to sully his good name by painting him as an incompetent buffoon of a flight instructor who led 13 men to their deaths." And remarkably, shamefully, the Navy obeyed the orders of the widow. They issued a report that said they were unable to determine the cause of the loss of Flight 19, and you know what happens now. An unknown cause means we have got a mystery on our hands. And when we have got a mystery on our hands, that means the mystery is going to attract every conspiracy crank, every paranormal crackpot, and every unscrupulous pseudoscientist author who sees an opportunity to sell some books, just like flies to a pile of cow dung. It was a man by the name of Edward Van Winkle Jones, writing in the Miami Herald on 17 September 1950, who first floated the idea that the disappearance of Flight 19 is just the latest in a long line of mysterious events that have transpired in the area that's roughly defined by Florida and Bermuda and Puerto Rico. He wasn't the man who christened it the Bermuda Triangle, but his column got picked up and syndicated by a sufficient number of Associated Press outlets that it planted the seed of the idea in the popular consciousness. 2 years later, Fate magazine published an article by George Sand entitled "Sea Mystery at Our Back Door." in which he fancifully elaborated on the earlier work of Mr. Jones and first proposed the idea of a 1,000-mile-wide triangular area where there has supposedly been an unusual preponderance of mysterious losses of ships and aircraft, though again, he didn't actually coin the term Bermuda Triangle. He pointed to the loss of Flight 19 and also 4 subsequent events that had happened in the intervening years. First was the January 1948 disappearance of Star Tiger, a British South American Airways passenger airliner. Second was the March 1948 disappearance of a fishing skiff with 3 men aboard, including the famed jockey Albert Snyder. Third was the December 1948 disappearance of an airborne transport DC-3 charter flight en route from Puerto Rico to Miami. Fourth was the January 1949 disappearance of Star Ariel, which was also another BSAA passenger plane. Another article appeared in the April 1962 issue of American Legion magazine, in which the author, Alan W. Eckhart, wrote that the leader of Flight 19 had been heard saying, "We can't be sure of any direction. Everything is wrong. Strange. The ocean doesn't look as it should," which was all a load of made-up bullshit, but hey, I guess it sold a lot of magazines. Then, in February 1964, Vincent Gaddis writes an article called The Deadly Bermuda Triangle in Argosy magazine, in which he posited that Flight 19 and other disappearances were part of a pattern of strange events in the region dating back to at least 1840, and the next year, right on cue, Mr. Gaddis expanded this article into a book titled Invisible Horizons. Perhaps not surprisingly, the book, and the oh-so-sexy and mysterious name Bermuda Triangle, did well enough to open up the veritable floodgates for a whole series of other execrable pseudo-historical trash books, including John Wallace Spencer's Limbo of the Lost in 1969, Charles Berlitz's The Bermuda Triangle in 1974, and Richard Winter's The Devil's Triangle also in 1974. Each of these idiot charlatans tried to outdo the last one in hinting at increasingly esoteric, even supernatural, even extraterrestrial explanations for the supposedly shockingly high number of mysterious disappearances in the area that was now commonly known as the Bermuda Triangle. And then in 1977, this stupid idea was implanted in the cultural memory once and for all when Steven Spielberg gave Flight 19 a prominent role and made its men into the victims of an alien abduction in his film Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And all of this ridiculous nonsense was based on absolutely nothing. The Bermuda Triangle is a classic case of pre-internet clickbait, because that's exactly what it was. You can draw a 1,000-mile-wide equilateral triangle over pretty much any area in any of the world's oceans and construct a myth that says an unusual number of mysterious disappearances have happened there. But, spoiler alert, lots of mysterious disappearances have happened everywhere. Mysterious disappearances are an unavoidable byproduct of sailing on the world's oceans and flying in its skies. Even in the present day, when we have global GPS and satellite radar coverage, we still love to build fanciful nonsense theories around mysterious disappearances. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 being the most obvious example in recent history. And it's fascinating to consider how much less of this garbage there would have been in the past 80 years if the US Navy hadn't bowed to the pressure campaign of one widow and simply issued a correct and factual report on the loss of the 5 planes and the 14 men of Flight 19, who still lie undiscovered in some watery grave at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. I'm done, that's all I've got. Thanks very much indeed for watching. Do feel free to like and subscribe and drop a few coins in the hat if you were so inclined. Have a great day and a pleasant tomorrow. See you next time. Get off my lawn.